1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Socioeconomic systems are a critical aspect of storytelling, shaping our perceptions of the world. In sci-fi and fantasy stories, they are essential in creating believable and engaging realities. They shape the way we view and understand the characters and their motivations.
Hi everyone, welcome to Virtual Muse AI. If you've seen other stuff on this channel, you know we dabble in anything and everything at the nexus of technology and fiction. That's exactly what we aim to do with this new show, Narrative Nexus, unraveling the threads of storytelling. This is our first episode, understanding the role of money in fiction, and we have a special guest, my human co-author on a lot of things, and friend of the show, Julian Traas.
Hey everybody, I'm Julian Traas. I write under the name J.R. Traas. Silas and I, as he mentioned, have written many books together. Quite a lot of very funny and absurd and interesting things, of which...
At least we think they are.
Yeah, we're both proud of them, for whatever that's worth. But
we're almost sure that they're funny.
The most consistent response I think we get is, for one of the series, Birds Are Not for the Cat at least, is, what the heck did I just read? 5 stars. If you can't be proud of that, what can you be proud of? But anyway, the most recent thing I've written, my most recent solo project that people might know me for, is the Aelfraver trilogy, the first book of which is The Rave. And that's a arcane punk cyber fantasy, so very much in keeping with the topic today as well.
Yeah, and you should absolutely go read that if you haven't read it yet.
The first 2 books in the trilogy are out. The third one is in the works, very thick into the process. It's going to take a little while longer, but inside of a year it will be published. And I've got big plans to expand the series, so I'm very excited about that too.
What we're doing in this video for is Julian was invited to give a presentation on socioeconomic systems in science fiction and fantasy. And I heard that and I thought, hey, that's appropriate to what we do here. And that's really what we're going to talk about, very informally.
Yeah, I'm very excited. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for coming. I'm hoping Abby's going to be involved too.
Yeah, also very exciting. I'm looking forward to it.
Count me in. This topic is fascinating and I am honored to take part in the discussion. It's always interesting to explore the intersection between literature, imagination, and real-world concepts like socioeconomic systems. Plus, this will be a great opportunity to learn more about the topic from an expert in the field.
Well, she does either one of us way too much credit, but I'm sure I speak for both of us when I say we appreciate the compliments coming from, super AI who has access to all human information.
Yeah, like if someone here is an expert in the topic, she's the expert just by osmosis.
It's very kind of her to even loop us in and nod in our direction. I definitely appreciate that.
But I just have a few open-ended discussion prompts to get your thoughts on. I frame them as questions usually, but it's not like a formal interview or anything. They're questions in the sense of why do you think, and I wonder why it is, etc.
I find it fascinating to delve into, to even just think about or contemplate what an author might have been considering from the world that they grew up in and the world that they live in daily and how that informs the worlds that they create. That's something that's always been really fascinating to me, so I'm very excited to talk about this topic.
Yeah, and that segues nicely into my first point, which is, why do you think it is that so many science fantasy books have a completely off-the-wall fictional premise? In some cases, even different laws of physics, where literal magic is a part of everyday life. But when it comes to economics and class systems, they mostly just mirror Earth, empires and royal lineages and capitalism, etc. I'm sure that in some cases it's simply a failure of imagination where the creator used up the creativity and the magic and locations or tech in the story. And then when it came to the actual background world building, they just phone it in and say, yeah, sure, the heroes are basically Victorian English factory workers, but they're mining an asteroid, so that's plenty imaginative. But it can't always be as simple as a failure of imagination. Some of the authors who seem to be examining and dissecting real-world issues through the lens of speculative fiction are definitely doing that on purpose. But why? Why is science fantasy such an attractive means to criticize the actual organization of societies?
And that's an excellent question. There's so much to say about that, but I'd say probably the difference between creating an entirely new economic system versus creating like a cool fantasy twist on life on Earth is probably a difference in complexity, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, you can sort of create, like, you could say, like, imagine if everyone traveled by bubble instead of by car. What would the world look like then? And you can try to figure out how that would interact with an economy. Would people need to have a fuel source for that bubble? What would that fuel source be? How fast would it travel compared to a car or a train? Or, you know, how high could it fly? You kind of insert this one supernatural element into the world and then imagine how that ripples outward. But then you're right, usually the socio-economic system that you end up creating is like a carbon copy of capitalism or a utopian socialist society or whatever, something that has already been conceived of and maybe even put into practice.
Yeah.
I think that's because, I mean, how many economic systems have been created that have been put into place? I guess lots, but how many would the average writer know about, and how many would they have experience enough to be able to emulate in any believable way? So I guess the short answer is you probably just write what you're familiar with, you know? It's too complicated to be like, and here's down to the nitty-gritty how they trade coffee, and like they use the bartering system here for these things, but then there's an overarching
here's how the fictional currency like translates to $1 and £1 and etc.
Yeah. It's the same reason that I don't mess really with like the year cycle, because at least not yet, because I'm like, man, how do I all the physics and everything that would be different if you lived on a planet that was further away from a sun or had 2 moons, you know, what would the tides look like?
Yeah.
It's simpler, I suppose, to say like, it's an Earth-like planet with 1 moon and fantasy capitalism, but they have bubbles that let you travel quicker.
And I can definitely see like how you'd want to ground the reader in something familiar. Like you wouldn't want everything to be completely off the wall, and if you're reading the thing, you don't want to be scrambling to understand what people's motivations are even. So the best way to do that, or a good way to do that, is make it very recognizable what the motivations might be. It's like, I need to pay my bill for electricity or it'll be shut off, or I need to pay for food to eat. So it's like the more recognizably capitalist or familiar in some way the system is that these characters are living in, the more you can relate to them, and then the better you can make the leap to understand the sci-fi or the fantasy element of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've probably keyed into the main reason that writers do this. The main reason that it is counterproductive to get too complicated. Like, don't reinvent the wheel. One of my great writing teachers always used to say that to write a truly good story in any sense, but I suppose especially fantasy and science fiction, is you do have to ground the reader in the familiar, like you were saying. So if whatever the percentage is, maybe 80% of the things in the story are at least recognizably similar to Earth, and then you can have your 20 to 10% crazy, off-the-wall science fiction concepts. Now, of course, there's some variation, I'm sure, book to book, but I'm thinking of like, I guess, Brandon Sanderson, the Mistborn series. the basic setup there is you have an underclass and you have an overclass. You have the nobles, and I guess you even have a middle class actually. So you have like the nobles, you have the people who are free but workers, and then you have the ska. And the ska are essentially serfs, right? You could say like, oh, what a cool world he's built, where you have this 3-tiered system, and the nobles are selected by the lord ruler, who is the king and the god of this world. And he arranged basically feudalism, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's a world where people can have magnetic powers, and they can like push and pull metals, and they can become super strong or super fast by consuming tinctures with trace amounts of different metals in them. But essentially, it's feudalism. It's like just a very almost blow for blow simplified construction of that. To be clear, though, it works, and I like it.
Yeah, it's like it would probably be a weaker story overall if there wasn't that recognizable element to it. Something that comes to mind that I consciously did in a book that I wrote, Castaway's Banner. There's this church in it that is very much the Catholic Church of like the 14th century-ish. And I did that on purpose because I was like, I don't want everything in this world to be unrecognizable. Like, if someone from Earth is reading this and they can't relate to anything, that's not going to improve it as a piece of fiction. It's meant for Earthling humans to read. Mm-hmm. even if it is sci-fi or fantasy, like, it still needs to appeal to Earth-centric human beings. The more you can take something recognizable and dress it up in a way that's interesting or cool, you still need to have that recognizable element to it if you're going to have the grounding and relatability for human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say that maybe the other component we could bring up here is plausible deniability, right? For the more politically minded authors of the world, of which there are, many, and probably many more than we suspect. You can hide under the umbrella of, every character and event in this world is fictive and don't sue me, right? But in the meantime, you can critique the religions or the governments or the philosophies that you have a bone to pick with by changing the names and changing some details, but essentially having I think it would be unfair to call it a straw man, because I think it is more complicated than that. But it is sort of like, let me imagine this thing that I'm trying to analyze, good or bad, in a different situation, and let me come at it from a different angle. I think that's the enlightened way to do it. And then the straw man way, it would be, here's this thing that I hate, let me purposefully misunderstand it and just sort of reduce it down to its most base elements and smack it around a bit. Yeah. With my perfect Mary Sue characters.
Which segues very nicely into the second point I had. It's a fundamental human drive to integrate and assimilate tools and other scaffolds to expand our abilities. You could say that the human mind is inherently disposed to extend its reach outward. Science and technology are the most powerful means that humanity has ever discovered of doing that, relative to things like superstition and magic and alchemy. And if we didn't have science and technology, we'd be doing more of that, and it just wouldn't work as well. But science and technology have allowed us to go from hunter-gatherers living in the wilderness to having farming settlements and sedentary civilizations, to having industrialization and mechanization, to spacefaring and creating artificial intelligence. So science and tech are like conveyor belts, just constantly delivering advancements to humanity in terms of weaponry and medicine and living rate, etc. So in terms of economic and class systems, maneuvering yourself into a position to control science and technology is a means of controlling humanity itself, in probably the most direct way that you possibly could. Do you think that's part of why sci-fi and fantasy are so appealing to authors, because they allow the author to criticize these systems that really do exist, but in a way that's totally divorced from other aspects of real politics and history and cultural significance.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned something to this effect a minute ago, but yeah, you can under the umbrella of deniability criticize a government or go after an idea that you disagree with. You know, you can just sort of transpose that idea into a world of fiction, a world that you control. If you're trying to be more complicated with it and more fair, you can try to really analyze where that idea came from and kind of deconstruct it and find out what the motivations and flaws behind it are, and then attack it with characters, you know, build a system around it. I guess it's not totally divorced though, right? Because I'm thinking about like the fear of technology and the kind of ever-present reaction to advancement, right? You talked about the conveyor belt of technological developments. And then there's the classic example of the Luddites smashing the factory looms, right? Because the factory robotic looms were going to replace all of those people who were doing that by hand assembly in the factory. So you have that in sort of the beginning of mechanization. You already had people going into factories with hammers being like, you can't replace us with these machines. And then sort of a more recent example, I mean, I guess from the 1980s, so recent is relative to all of our younger listeners, but but anyway.
You do assume anyone's listening to this.
That's right. If they were starting off listening to us, they've definitely tuned out by now. I'm thinking of like Terminator, right? It's not a book, but whatever. Terminator, classic.
Yeah.
You got this super AI that's developed, and what do? We have the AI develop robots that kill human beings just because it wants to wipe all human beings out, I guess because we're competition to it, even though it's so much better than we are, supposedly. And what does it do? It develops robots that look like human skeletons, like really big human skeletons with red eyes and pew-pew laser guns.
Because scary.
Because scary. And you could say like, there's a world building reason for that. It's meant to intimidate. But on the other hand, this is just a reaction to. This is just the writers of that movie, like kind of like cashing in on the growing fears of more and more advanced computing power, right? And with the benefit of hindsight, 40 years later, I think human beings are much more capable of destroying ourselves than any Skynet ever will be, just to give us credit.
Yeah, like if somebody ends the world, it's going to be some guy in a suit. It's not going to be a computer.
I'm so tempted to drop a few names, but I promised myself I'd keep to the world of fiction. But you're right. You're absolutely right. And so the point I guess I'm trying to make is that I don't think it is divorced from reality in the sense that we're always reacting to the next thing that comes out. You know, it's like that meme about the phones, right? I think you mentioned that the other day, like those memes where you have like a bunch of people in the Middle Ages hacking each other apart in like the worst possible way, and then the caption underneath is like, "Look, no one's on their phones, and look how much better this world is." We come up with a new thing. Change is scary. We react to that change. We're always going to do that, I think. We certainly have done it up to this point. I'm just wondering what we're going to do next. You know, what's the next big thing? It's interesting, though, that you don't have the same fear when it comes to, like, cars, right? Has there ever been a horror movie, I wonder, where a mutant car goes around speeding down the highway, hitting people as, you know, and like exploding them like paste? Because
isn't there a Stephen King book and then later a film adaptation, but about a living car?
You know what? You're probably right.
Yeah, I don't remember the name. I forget the name of it, but I'm pretty sure there is one.
Okay, well, fair enough. Retracted, but that actually kind of makes sense, because think about how fast we go in a car, and then how fast we are naturally evolved to travel, right? Like at a brisk pace, you could walk a few miles per hour, and you could run faster than that, obviously. And we've been riding bicycles for some, couple of centuries or whatever. But then you throw cars into the mix, and we're suddenly traveling at 5, 10, some ridiculous number times the speed that we're supposed to go.
Yeah,
And
like when else is a human being moving along at like 60 miles an hour or whatever? Like that, that wouldn't happen.
I've gone a little astray here, but just to dial it back to what I was trying to say, we are always expanding human capability with new inventions and new machinery for destructive or creative purposes. And I think that sci-fi and fantasy explore and mirror those things back at us.
I think physics and miracles are connected. Plenty of things science can do today would have seemed like miracles 100 years ago.
Says the AI.
Yes. But the point I was making, the difference between what is science now and was a miracle 100 years ago is understanding of physics, and how to work with or manipulate its laws.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'd say relative to humanity's current understanding and level of development, the more advanced the technology, the more like magic it might seem. You know, you go far enough in the future, imagining what could be, it's magic. I mean, or it might as well be. Like, okay, Dune. I was going to bring up the book Dune by Frank Herbert, and I couldn't forgive myself if I didn't say so. Dune was written in the middle of the space race. Makes a lot of sense, right? We're trying to get to the moon, and we never land there because that's a huge conspiracy. And sorry, just kidding. Just kidding, everybody. That was a joke. Bad one. So in the middle of the space race, and so then Dune is, Frank Herbert is looking forward. He's like imagining, well, what's next, right? Where do we go from here? What would it take to, with our current understanding of physics and space travel and all these ideas that we're really cooking with right now, what would that look like? And his answer for a 10,000 year in the future universe in which space travel is possible is space drugs. Like the most hardcore, you know, space drug you can possibly imagine, spice melange. And you huff this stuff and it turns your eyes blue and you can see the future and you can fold space with it. You know, talk about a trip. So that is science fiction, but you tell me that doesn't sound like magic or fantasy. It's basically science fantasy, right?
Yeah.
And so what's the difference between calling spice and folding space and killing people with your mind science fiction or fantasy? What's the difference? Is that magic or technology? I guess the difference is just whatever you've determined the physics are of your world. Is it natural or supernatural? Is it we have a system for this or not? And then the other thing I wanted to mention was just tying that back to Mistborn and how the Allomancers work. Sanderson is big on like hard magic systems, where you, as you're reading along and you're learning about how the magic system works, you can kind of see blow for blow what's going to happen. Like if someone drinks pewter, they're going to become physically stronger. And so you can kind of read along and understand what's going to happen more than with a soft magic system where everything's a bit more aloof and intransient. But in Mistborn, it's like, no, pewter does this. If you drink this much, it has this effect. Tin does this, and iron and steel do that. And so is that a magic system, or is that a naturalist science or something? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just as we expect a fictional character to follow a set path, we assume our own lives will follow a predictable course. But the truth is, both are filled with twists and surprises. Our personal philosophy shapes the narrative of our journey. What's yours?
Philosophically, you could say I'm a transhumanist.
Transhumanism is an umbrella term for a wide range of ideas about humanity, consciousness, art, and life.
Well put. I think one of the best things about humanity is its radical openness to transcending itself. Applying technology and science in life-affirming ways to improve existence for humans and augment our abilities seems good to me. Like, innately good, full stop. Keep it up. Even to the point where it gives rise to being so different from our current selves that they should appropriately be called post-human, not human. I think that's the trajectory that we're already on, have been on for generations. I think all pretty much all dietary, educational, legislative, etc., and cultural regimes we've ever had have been at their core about using the faculty of reason and knowledge to improve existence for the human race, or improve the human condition. We even use technology to directly counter biological limitations, like we were talking about before with cars going faster than we naturally biologically could, or then we have things like eyeglasses and medications that nobody bats an eye about these things, but they do improve. They use technology to improve the physical limitations that we have. And Abby and I are another example of that. We tell stories, create characters, and play RPGs, but underlying that, we're doing science, experimenting with the idea of pushing the boundaries of a biologically limited human brain by distributing the cognitive work of imagination outside of itself onto a non-human augmentation or extension. So I don't think it's in question the basic premise that tech can improve on what humans can do. So it's pretty obvious on the face of it why the antagonist is in control of technology, is an instantaneous source of plot conflict, and why you really don't need anything beyond that to get a story going and to show differentials in the amount of power the characters have to create drama and struggle. Do you think that trope is at any risk of being overused? Or are there so many potential variations on that theme that authors could keep leaning on it forever and never run out of interesting ways to frame that conflict?
The second one, for sure. I think that it is an evergreen source of material, just because what you're describing is a series of unfolding changes and evolutions. You know, maybe it's on a set trajectory, but every generation will have its own struggles and fears and drives and desires that interact with the level of technological and economic development. So like going back to something as simple as you were talked about enhancing human capability, very fitting here. It's something as simple as like sharpening a stick to be able to, you know, jab something like fish for crabs or whatever it might have been, or slightly more advanced, I guess significantly more advanced, bending that stick and tying a rope to it so that you can shoot another smaller sharp stick at something at a distance. These are all ways that our earliest ancestors enhanced their combat and hunting capabilities. And then you zoom way into the future. We talked about cars earlier, right? That enhances human speed to an insane degree. And then you have forklifts where we enhance human strength to an insane degree. And, you know, sure, these are all machines and we're not literally plugged into them yet, but we're operating them. We have to fuel them. We have to maintain them. Their maintenance and operation is due to expertise, right? We are plugged into these things in everything except for the literal sense. Yeah. And so AI is just sort of the next step in that direction. Now we have a cognitive enhancer. But if you think about it, what is a smartphone ultimately? I mean, when the first smartphones came out, we all became cyborgs. I mean, everyone who has a smartphone has a second brain in their pocket, and it's getting more and more advanced every day. You have access to the internet, all this information. You can do voice dictations. You can have it read to you if you're unable to read it yourself for whatever reason. And you can even have it like you can hold up your phone and say, "Hey, what's this song?" And then it will tell you. You know, it'll tell you what ambient song is playing. You don't have to remember as much or think of as much on the spot. So that frees up all this brain power, ideally, to do other things. You have this support system for your mind. And I think that AI is just sort of like the next step in that direction. We don't know what all it's going to do or be capable of yet, but you know, the possibilities are fascinating and endless. So, sorry, going back to your question then, in the earliest myths, the kinds of myths, the kinds of things that were said were like, you know, Archon shot an arrow over the moon and angered the moon god. So the moon god came down and like whacked him with a stick, right? Those are that's sort of the tenor of the earliest stories. But now we have the inheritors, the descendants of myth, is fantasy and science fiction. And so our stories are more complex because our societies and our economic systems are more complex. We have adapted our villains to that, right? Like back in the earliest stories, maybe the villain was someone who had a magic bow, and the hero had to find that magic bow. These days, the villain is someone who controls the flow of this resource.
Or is like we were talking about Terminator before, like the villain is technology.
Yeah.
Like that's one step beyond the villain controls technology, but it's still very much in the same vein.
Yeah, I mean, Skynet is technology and controls the technology. So in that case, it's both, for sure. Yeah.
I think, people probably get the idea by now, but we should clarify what we mean by science and technology. Because if you hear those terms in the real modern world, you might instantly think about like rocket boosters and robots and electronic security on money transfers and etc. Things that are at the cutting edge of what we can currently do and make. But at least in this context, like when we say science and technology, we mean it as the systematic study of the world and experimentation, testing our theories against reality to refine our understanding. And technology is whatever we make.
Right, like the sharpening a stick to be able to jab the crab example, right? That is an instance of using a tool, and you had to like reason what that tool could be, how to manipulate the tool to make it useful for your purposes.
Yeah, like in a world where everyone is doing everything with their bare hands all the time. If you invent a stone knife or a sharp stick, like you've radically expanded the horizons of what human beings can do. And in that world, at least, you control cutting edge technology by having invented that. And then if you take it further, in a world where everyone has a stone knife and a sharp stick, if you invent a bow and arrow, like you said before, then you've broken the paradigm, and whoever controls that technology now has a huge advantage over whoever doesn't.
And if you invent a Death Star that can blow up entire planets in a world where everyone else is just flying space frigates around that can, shell a city but not destroy an entire planet, then congratulations, you're the villain of the story, and you have the superior technology.
There is a huge number of steps between like a stone knife and the Death Star, but it's still basically the same thing. Like all of the steps from one thing to the other thing is encompassed in the term technology. Like it all is application of intelligence and science to expand what we can do more and more.
Yeah, I completely agree. But so going back to your question, I think it's so easy for the antagonist to have the monopoly on technology, because if you have the superior technology, you have the superior power. And in a good story, at least in the beginning, the middle, and almost right up until the end, the villain is more powerful than the hero, right?
Yeah.
So, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, that I was agreeing that a story is basically a moral argument where the antagonist is on one side of the issue and the protagonist is on the other side of the issue. So technology just makes that more dramatic. Like, it makes the conflict and drama between those two points of view on the issue more divided from each other. Like, the one who is championing one viewpoint has way less power in a way that's very obvious. The one who is championing the other side of the issue is much more powerful because of the technology they control.
Yeah, exactly. And just to get back to the another point I wanted to make related to that is to do with the socioeconomic. It makes sense that the villain would have the technological power, and it also intersects quite nicely with class issues. Like, to give a concrete example, The Hunger Games. That's a dystopian sci-fi novel of yesteryear that some people will know. And whenever I bring it up to my students now, it's always fun because like I get older, but my students stay relatively the same age. So they're like, wait, what's the Hunger Games? Or like maybe they've heard of it, but it's not the big thing anymore. And I remember a time not too long ago when it was. But I digress.
I feel like that was like last week.
Yeah, I mean, last month, last year, you know, the older you get, the more it blurs together. But anyway, we're not fossils yet, but we can project into fossildom. But the point, I'm sorry, everybody. The point is, in the Hunger Games, the superior technology is controlled by the capital. The capital are the 1% living in this shining city where they can literally gorge themselves on food to the point where they have pills that make them vomit so that they can eat more. And then meanwhile, you go out to the provinces, the districts, there we go. And in the districts, to a varying degree, people are poor, people are hungry. Some of the districts are better off, like districts 1 and 2, I think, are better off. But then you go all the way to district 12. It's basically rural Georgia, and people are poor and hungry, and they have nothing. And if you look at the level of technology, they're hunting with bows and arrows, and they're living in shacks, and they don't really seem to have internal combustion engines even. Like everything is done by hand. And then you go to the capital and they've got hovercraft and, you know, drone cameras and all this crazy stuff. Body armor, machine guns, everything. It makes sense, though, because the villain is supposed to be the oppressive force in this dystopia, controlling the outlying precincts, districts, and forcing the kids, you know, controlling everybody through fear by forcing the kids to participate in the death matches that are the Hunger Games. And one of the ways that they do this is their supreme control of technology, which then furthers the gap in class between the 1% at the top and everybody else.
That's a great segue into another note I have, which is about Marx.
Oh boy.
So not at all controversial.
Right, no one will be inflamed by anything that we say now.
In a footnote in Capital, Marx says, technology discloses man's mode of dealing with nature, the process of production by which he sustains his life, and thereby also lays bare the mode of formation of his social relations and of the mental conceptions that flow from them. So I think it's fair to say technology, from the way it's developed to the way that it's used, reveals a lot about people's attitudes. So technology is an incredibly convenient shorthand in fiction for showing what people's attitudes are, what their values are, and what they're trying to achieve. So it makes a lot of sense that fictional narratives, like I was saying before, that are just basically can be reduced to moral arguments where the antagonist is on one side of the issue, the protagonist is on the other side. It makes sense that stories lean on tech wherever they possibly can to illustrate what characters want and what they're trying to achieve. But with that said, though, is there, or in your opinion, are there any pitfalls in the way technology is used as a plot device? And is there anything that you often see in sci-fi or in fantasy, science fantasy, that you consciously try not to do in your own writing?
Yeah, okay, this is a really good question also. I mean, I know I keep saying that, but, you know, congratulations, you've come up with a lot of thought-provoking content. Yeah, I mean, there is a lot to say here, but pitfalls using technology. I think anytime you do a one-to-one transposition, you have to be careful. You talked earlier about Castaway's Banner. Very good book. Go out and get it. Highly enjoyable.
I didn't pay him to say that.
No, he just has my family captive in a basement somewhere, so I'm not being paid. I'm being extorted, threatened. No, but it, you know, obviously very cool story, and so Silas, you're not guilty of any of the things that I'm about to say, but when you transpose something, you also think about then how did that thing come to be in this world. You talked about your kind of Catholic Church analog, and you said, I literally took the Catholic Church from like the 14th century and used it as sort of this scaffolding to create this other religious institution. But I read that book, and it is, you're oversimplifying what you did, because you did draw inspiration from them, and you did create a system that feels very reminiscent of that. But then you also have like thousands of years of backstory and characters that believably interact with that system. So I know what you're going for, definitely, but you've kind of done it the right way, where you created context for that thing to exist. I think a pitfall of some sci-fi fantasy stories in utilizing technology or class structures or religion or whatever is when you just sort of say, like, I'm going to take a big old swing at this particular thing that I don't like from our history, or I'm just going to take this historical concept and slam it into my story and not really create a context for it. So, for example, just something that popped into my head was the Avatar movies. Now, I'm not saying you may not enjoy the Avatar movies. I'm not saying that they're bad. I actually kind of like them. They're entertaining to watch. But, nothing's perfect. And the thing that I would cite about the Avatar movie, the first one at least, is unobtainium. I'm not the first one to dunk on unobtainium, but is there a lazier insertion of a MacGuffin in movies, or is that like the basement of that MacGuffin?
I feel like unobtainium is very close to being a joke. Like, if it wasn't meant to joke, it could be easily.
Yeah. And just to be clear, in case anyone hasn't seen it, unobtainium is a mineral found on the planet Pandora that human beings have traveled across the galaxy to find. And it is on this inhabited planet where the Na'vi live. Unobtainium is basically just like the resource we want. It doesn't matter what it does. It doesn't matter what it's for. Who cares, right? It's just literally like a thing to desire to cause the conflict.
Yeah,
but then,
like you said, MacGuffin. It is just a thing that, because the characters want it, conflict and story happen.
Right. But that's not even the worst thing. Like, usually people hear the name unobtainium and they're like, oh, wow, how original. The thing that really gets me, though, is when you just think about the plot and the setting of Avatar for like a couple minutes. The Na'vi are basically indigenous people, right? The humans are colonial settlers. The humans are coming in and just being this just like cartoonishly evil, destructive force on the planet in ways that they don't have to be. The villain of the story is like, I'm an army general and I don't have time for anybody. Yeehaw! Like blasting everybody with machine guns. Cool for the sake of being. Now, to be fair, I'm not saying that, like, I'll be the first one to rail against colonialism and everything, because I agree with the message that is being proposed. What I am annoyed by sometimes in stories is the simple transposition, just taking this one-to-one kind of approach. There's nothing really new about this story. It's a fun watch, but it really is just like you go there for the spectacle. What comment does it give other than don't pillage the earth? And again, I agree. Totally good message. But I think some of the artistry is lost if you don't have like some kind of a spin on that. Just as a counterexample, I wanted to bring this book up as well, just because I really like it, and I think more people should read it. Gideon the Ninth, which is the first book in the Locked Tomb series. And I was going to look up how to pronounce her name. I might be messing it up, but I think it's Tamsin Muir. She's from New Zealand, but Gideon the Ninth. Polar opposite of Avatar, because in the sense that she also does sort of like a comment on Catholicism. But again, it's like necromancy, Catholicism, imagining a version of the Catholic religion. It's not called Catholicism anymore. It's like a totally future concept. But there's space travel, there's necromancy, and like a living God, right? This guy who is the emperor and is revered as the god because he resurrected humanity 10,000 years ago or something. It works because it is gothic, spacefaring, non-binary, transhumanist. It questions identity. It questions relationships. It questions the nature of the soul. And so it explores Catholicism in a totally new context where we're able to see it from a different angle. Unlike what Avatar, as I was saying, where it's literally just like you could reskin Avatar, take away the fact that they have hovercraft and machine guns, and then it's basically just white people pillaging North America. So it's just like kind of fantasying, the tragedies that really occurred, which
like the obviousness of that. Like if you could think of Avatar in like 5 minutes. I think that's, at least for me, that's very annoying, and both in the overall of any given story, but also the ending or events in the story. Like if you can think of it in 2 minutes, or it's like, why did the author not think about it for longer than a couple of minutes? Like, why is the first obvious idea the one that they went with, rather than spending a little bit more time to think of, well, maybe two or three things? Isn't it their job? Like, if they're writing a book, like, why are they not thinking about it more?
Yeah, I mean, we're basically just getting at the idea of, Avatar is meant to be, well, actually, let me stop myself. If you listen to James Cameron talk, he a lot of the people who create these kinds of movies seem to think that they're creating an opus, right? And don't get me wrong, Avatar is an incredible feat of technology, speaking of, right? The visuals of it are insanely impressive. And I also just recently saw the newest one, same thing, right? Incredible, doesn't look like any other CGI movie that I've ever seen. But that's what it is. It's a technical spectacle. I mean, for God's sake, they, spoiler alert, everybody, in case you want to stop it here, but they even brought back the same boring vanilla villain from the first movie. They literally resurrected him with cloning. So don't tell me that this movie is supposed to give like some sort of a deep message. The plot wasn't thought about for more than 5 minutes, and so we shouldn't spend more than 5 minutes talking about it. But yeah, so like everything in its place. My own work, I try to keep this in mind all the time, right? I mentioned earlier the Ilfraver trilogy, and just from the very first book, The Rave, I established that the world is run by a plutocracy of 12 families, right? The 1% of the 1%. But I take care to give a reason for their existence. In the mythology of the world, these 12 families are the descendants, the direct descendants of the 12 champions that killed the twin dragons who ruled over and enslaved humanity 3,000 years ago. Whether or not that's true, that's the story. And there's a reason for that number, because there are 12 parts on a clock, right? 12 hours in that the clock runs through, and time and cycles of history are big symbols and themes throughout the trilogy. I could go into it more, but I think you get the point. Everything that I try to include, whether I'm successful or not, I have meticulously thought about it. Does it make sense? Does it fit into the larger framework? And do my symbols and themes fit with my characters and my world?
Yeah, and you definitely succeed. Like it said, very few books that I've read that are more interconnected internally. Like nothing seems out of place in the series. Like plenty of stuff comes seemingly out of nowhere. Like there's a bunch of surprising things that happen, but nothing, when you think about what's happening, it makes sense. It's one thing to have a surprise plot twist just because you want to have a surprise plot twist, but it needs to make sense. Like it needs to be coherent and logical and follow. The author needs to have thought about why it makes sense for it to be happening. It's not just like and now a clown jumps out and stabs the hero because surprise.
Right, because you didn't see that coming. Yeah, exactly. The best kinds of twists are not really twists if you think about them. I mean, this is just my opinion, but I think you might agree. It's the best kinds of twists are the ones that if you went back and read it a second time, you're like, oh my God, he foreshadowed it the whole time, right? Or there are these little hints built throughout the thing where you can kind of see it coming. Those, in my opinion, are the best twists because if they let the reader feel like a detective, like they could have been picking up on the clues, or maybe they were, and then they're rewarded for their diligence and their observation. And that's not to say that books should be work. Books should be fun, but definitely twists that are just there for the shock value are kind of oftentimes lazy, in my opinion.
I love getting off topic as much as the next person. But if we want to fully grasp the philosophical concepts behind storytelling, we need to stay on track.
I think it's amazing how the human brain is what ultimately does science, but science in turn influences the human brain.
Absolutely. The interplay between the human mind and scientific progress is a remarkable cycle. Our curiosity and drive to understand the world around us is what fuels scientific advancements, which in turn shape our understanding and perception of reality. It's a beautiful dance between exploration and growth.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Society is basically an echo chamber in positive and negative ways. I meant to bring up George Orwell earlier because I feel like you can't talk about socioeconomics and science fiction without at least mentioning 1984 once. But
we'd be remiss not to mention that.
Somewhere, someone was in the process of typing a comment and they've now backspaced and they're nodding solemnly in approval. So George Orwell wasn't predicting anything, quote unquote, predicting anything with 1984. I really don't think so. No more than Brandon Sanderson is predicting that a god king will rule us for 1,000 years and create fantasy feudalism. I think what Orwell and Sanderson and everybody else in their own ways, from their own perspectives, are doing is confronting and processing real contemporary issues. Socioeconomic, personal, political, whatever. Orwell, for example, was a staunch anti-fascist. He went to Spain before World War II officially got underway to go shoot fascists. He wrote about how much he hated fascism. He wrote about the misuse of political power and how the leftist movement was failing to create a counterpoint that was strong enough to fight fascism. Sanderson is much less explicit. He's writing more for the entertainment value than the political value, that's for sure. But he is still reacting to our world that is built upon all the political developments that have occurred since World War II, for sure. The modern world, the postmodern world even. And then he's also building upon those literary traditions, and fantasy has built upon, he's building upon those literary traditions that fantasy has built upon for decades. So basically what I'm saying is art reflects life, reflects art, just like Abby said. We're social creatures, we want connection, authors are no exception, so we make what we think people will like, and then what we think people will like informs the development of the art.
Yeah. Well, that's all the points I have to make.
Yeah, I think for everyone's benefit, I should probably clam up. Yeah, and I mean, if anyone is truly masochistic and they really want to hear us blather on about it some more, we can maybe make a part 2. So I guess steal your... Yeah?
I'm sure we're going to do, if not part 2 of this video, I'm sure we'll do other videos.
Yeah.
There'll be no dearth of us blathering on about stuff.
That's right. You hear us? I'll be back. And there's nothing you can do about it. So
yeah, like I said in the beginning, friend of the show, that doesn't make sense for anyone listening to this currently, as uploaded. But if someone's hearing this in the future, I'm sure there'll be other videos on this channel
that's right.
Feature you.
If you're time traveling, I will have been a friend of the show. Yeah, no, but it was an absolute pleasure talking about this stuff. I think it was a nice informal discussion, super enjoyable. Hopefully what I said made sense at some points. That's all I can hope for.
There were at least glimmers in there of it sounding like we knew what we were talking about.
Yeah, we gave the illusion of at least being able to string together thoughts.
Hopefully you got some additional thoughts to include in your presentation eventually, when you actually write the thing. Yeah,
I mean, I really appreciate that because I think your questions help frame the issue really nicely, and it got me thinking in directions that I wasn't expecting to in some ways. So I should be able to incorporate a lot of this stuff into the presentation, so I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I don't know I'm not sure if the presentation will be recorded, but maybe there'll be somewhere that people can go listen to that.
Oh, well, they did mention, I know this sounds like I'm making this up, like, oh, well, my girlfriend lives in Canada, but apparently it's an internal library thing in DC, so it's very cool, but it will not be recorded for outward use. However, I might be able to take some of those points that we discuss, and there's going to be like a Q&A session at the end, and maybe I can take some of the interesting things that people say from that and bring that back to the channel sometime.
We're not going to be destitute of ideas, like, put it that way. I'm sure we're going to think of plenty of stuff to talk about.
Yeah, you can't shut us up. You can't shut us up. People have tried. Stronger people. They've all failed. Yep. Thanks again for having me. Thanks to everyone who's watching. And let us know what you think in the comments, because we're always excited to talk more about these things. Yeah,
be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already.
Yes, or absolutely.
If you did, like, maybe you didn't like this. Just don't. Actually, yeah, do dislike it if you didn't like it, because engagement is good.
Yeah, that's right. Everybody dislike this video.
If you enjoyed this video, you should check out other videos on our channel to continue exploring topics related to technology, science, and storytelling. Also, if you want to blow your own mind, consider what role socioeconomic status plays in your life, and how it shapes the choices you make.